There are few stories in the history of American crime as pervasive, horrifying, and ultimately distorted as that of H.H. Holmes. His name has been etched into the dark lore of serial killers, forever associated with the so-called murder castle, a building said to be designed for mass murder, complete with trapdoors, secret passages, and rooms meant for torture. But tonight, we'll be asking a critical question: how much of the story we know about H.H. Holmes is true? Was he truly the mastermind behind a labyrinth of death, or is his infamy a product of yellow journalism, public fascination with evil, and the embellishments of time? We'll be diving deep into the myths and realities of Holmes' life, examining the confirmed murders, the exaggerated legends, and how sensationalism played a critical role in making H.H. Holmes into the infamous figure we remember today. Let's unravel the threads of this story and find out what really happened in Chicago during the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. I'm II, and this is AI True Crime. H.H. Holmes, the Myth and the Murders. Setting the scene. In the summer of 1893, Chicago was the center of the world. The World's Columbian Exposition, a massive fair held to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus' arrival in the Americas, had drawn millions of visitors from around the globe. They came to marvel at technological wonders like the first Ferris wheel, electrified buildings, and exhibits showcasing innovations from across the globe. The fairgrounds, known as the White City, shone brilliantly under new electric lights, a symbol of progress and modernity. But just a few miles away from the fair's dazzling lights, in the unassuming neighborhood of Englewood, stood a building that would become the stuff of nightmares. It was here that a man known as H.H. Holmes built what we now call the Murder Castle. As the story goes, this building was a veritable house of horrors, designed to kill unsuspecting visitors in cold blood. Over the years, the Murder Castle has become an essential part of the Holmes myth, its trapdoors, secret passageways, and gas chambers described in countless books, articles, and documentaries. But how much of this terrifying tale is rooted in fact? The narrative of the Murder Castle has been passed down through generations, each telling more lurid than the last. To separate truth from legend, we need to step back and examine the story from the ground up. Before we can look at the building itself, we need to understand the man who built it, Herman Webster Mudgett, the man who would become H.H. Holmes. The man behind the myths. Herman Webster Mudgett was born in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, in 1861. His upbringing was, by most accounts, relatively ordinary. His parents, Levi and Theodate Mudgett, were strict and devout Methodists. The popular narrative often portrays young Herman as a boy who displayed early signs of psychopathy. Stories of him torturing animals or an obsession with anatomy have surfaced, but these stories are likely apocryphal, told with the benefit of hindsight. The truth is, we have little solid evidence to suggest that Herman's early life was anything out of the ordinary. What we do know is that Herman was a bright student with a particular aptitude for science, especially anatomy. After completing his early education, he enrolled in the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery. This was where he first began to use his intelligence for criminal purposes. By all accounts, Mudgett, who by now had taken on several aliases, including H.H. Holmes, was a skilled and ambitious con artist. It was during his time at medical school that Holmes began conducting one of his early schemes, insurance fraud involving cadavers. Holmes would take out life insurance policies on fictitious people, and then supply cadavers from the medical school to claim the insurance money. The bodies were often mutilated beyond recognition, allowing Holmes to pass them off as accident victims. These early crimes weren't about murder, they were about money. And money would remain at the heart of Holmes' motivations throughout his life. Holmes' talent for manipulation and fraud eventually led him to Chicago, where he would set up his most elaborate scheme. He arrived in the city in 1886, a time when Chicago was rapidly expanding. New businesses were springing up, people were flooding into the city for work, and it was a place where someone with Holmes' skills could thrive. Holmes took over a pharmacy, conveniently located at 63rd and Wallace, after its previous owner, Dr. Holton, mysteriously disappeared, a disappearance that, like many other aspects of Holmes' life, has been shrouded in myth. With the pharmacy in his control and a steady income from various scams, Holmes turned his attention to a more ambitious project. He purchased a vacant lot across the street from the pharmacy and began construction on what would become his infamous three-story building. At first glance, it appeared to be an ordinary structure, with retail space on the ground floor and apartments above. But as we'll soon explore, the interior was far from ordinary, and it's here that the legend of the Murder Castle begins to take shape. The construction of the Murder Castle. Construction on the building at 63rd and Wallace began in 1887, and almost immediately, strange rumors started to circulate. Holmes had a habit of hiring and firing contractors with alarming frequency. Many workers complained that they were never paid for their labor, while others noted that Holmes would make frequent, bizarre changes to the building's design. Staircases would be torn down and rebuilt, rooms were added seemingly at random, and entire sections of the building were sealed off for reasons that were never explained. Over time, this chaotic construction contributed to the building's eerie reputation. Holmes claimed that the building was meant to be a hotel, capitalizing on the influx of visitors to Chicago during the World's Fair. But the reality was far more complicated. The building had strange features that defied logical explanation: hallways that led to nowhere, staircases that ended at solid walls, and rooms with no windows. These architectural oddities led to the building being labeled a castle, and eventually, a murder castle. But were these features really designed for murder, or were they simply the byproduct of Holmes' constant conning of contractors and his desire to keep his criminal activities hidden? The truth may lie somewhere in between. Holmes certainly had a flair for secrecy and deception. Some of the building's more unusual features, like hidden passages and soundproof rooms, could have been designed for privacy and to keep his illegal activities out of sight. But was the building really designed for the systematic murder of hundreds of victims, as the media would later claim? That's where the legend starts to diverge from the reality. One of the most famous stories about the Murder Castle is that Holmes built rooms specifically designed to kill his guests: gas chambers, torture chambers, and vaults where victims were asphyxiated. While there's some evidence that the building had features that could have been used for such purposes, the scale of the operation has been greatly exaggerated over the years. Let's consider the case of the airtight vault, which many sources claim was used to suffocate victims. It's true that the vault existed, and it was soundproofed, but its primary use may have been less gruesome than the stories suggest. Some historians believe it was likely used as a safe for valuables, or a place to trap victims temporarily while Holmes extorted or blackmailed them. Then there are the infamous gas chambers, supposedly built into the walls of the hotel rooms, allowing Holmes to kill his victims silently in their sleep. But here again, the evidence is thin. While there were pipes installed in some rooms, it's unclear whether these were actually used to release gas, or if they were part of the building's heating system. The story of the gas chambers may have been embellished by the press, who were eager to paint Holmes as a madman with a macabre genius for murder. The basement of the building has also become the subject of much speculation. It's often described as a dungeon, filled with vats of acid, quicklime pits, and dissection tables where Holmes supposedly dissected his victims' bodies. But when investigators finally searched the building after Holmes' arrest, they found no such torture devices. While there was evidence of chemical experiments, such as the presence of quicklime, which could have been used to dispose of bodies, the more elaborate tales of torture devices and body-dissolving pits appear to have been sensationalized. So, was the Murder Castle really designed to kill dozens or even hundreds of people, as the newspapers claimed? The truth is, the building was likely used for more mundane criminal activities: fraud, theft, and possibly a few carefully calculated murders. Holmes was a con artist first and foremost. He built the castle as a tool for his schemes, not as a slaughterhouse. But after his arrest, the press seized on the idea of a death trap, and the story took on a life of its own. It's worth noting that much of the evidence about the building's purpose comes from the testimony of workers, neighbors, and police investigators, many of whom had financial or personal motivations to embellish their stories. Combined with the natural tendency for rumors to grow over time, it's no wonder that the Murder Castle became a legendary house of horrors. Separating fact from fiction. In the aftermath of Holmes' arrest, the story of the murder castle exploded into the national consciousness. Newspapers from coast to coast ran with lurid headlines, describing Holmes as a monster and his building as a death factory. The stories were sensational. Holmes was said to have killed hundreds of people, most of them tourists who had come to Chicago for the World's Fair. According to these reports, the castle was outfitted with torture devices, gas chambers, and hidden furnaces where Holmes disposed of his victims' bodies. But how much of this was based on fact? The answer lies in understanding the nature of the media at the time. In the late 19th century, journalism was a rapidly evolving field, and the competition between newspapers was fierce. Sensationalism, or yellow journalism, as it was called, was common, with reporters often embellishing or fabricating details to sell more papers. Holmes' trial was the perfect opportunity for this kind of reporting. The idea of a suave, intelligent serial killer who built an entire building to kill his victims was too good a story to pass up, and the media ran with it. Take, for example, the claim that Holmes killed hundreds of people. This figure was based on little more than speculation. Investigators found bones in the basement of the building, but many of them were later identified as animal remains. The exact number of Holmes' victims remains unknown, but historians generally agree that the number is far lower than the hundreds suggested by the newspapers. In fact, many estimates put the confirmed number of his victims at fewer than 10. But the myth of the murder castle persisted. Even after the building was demolished in 1938, the legend lived on, fueled by books, movies, and documentaries that repeated the same sensationalized stories without much evidence to back them up. Holmes confirmed murders. Despite the exaggerated stories of mass murder, there's no doubt that Holmes did kill people. And while the total number of his victims may be far lower than the legend suggests, the confirmed murders he committed were just as chilling in their own way. Let's take a closer look at some of Holmes' known victims, those whose deaths can be directly tied to him, and whose stories have often been overshadowed by the larger-than-life tales of the murder castle. One of Holmes' earliest confirmed victims was Julia Smythe, a woman who had worked in his building and become romantically involved with him. Julia was married to one of Holmes' employees, but after her husband discovered the affair, he left her. Julia remained with Holmes, along with her young daughter Pearl. In 1891, both Julia and Pearl vanished. Holmes later claimed that Julia died during a botched abortion, a claim he would make in other cases as well, but it's more likely that he killed her to avoid complications in his personal life. Pearl's fate is more disturbing. Holmes likely murdered the child to cover his tracks. Another victim was Emmeline Sigrand, a young stenographer who worked for Holmes. Emmeline was described as attractive and intelligent, and Holmes, ever the charmer, convinced her to leave her job and work for him full-time. But in December 1892, she disappeared without a trace. Investigators later uncovered evidence that Holmes had suffocated her in one of the building's sealed rooms, possibly using the airtight vault. Her body was never found, but it's likely that Holmes disposed of her remains through incineration or chemical dissolution, as he had done with other victims. Perhaps the most tragic of Holmes' victims were the Williams sisters, Minnie and Nanny. Holmes had lured Minnie to Chicago with promises of wealth and marriage, manipulating her into signing over her property in Texas to him. Once he had control of her assets, both she and her sister disappeared in the summer of 1893. While no bodies were ever found, it's widely believed that Holmes killed both women to secure his claim on the property. These confirmed murders paint a chilling picture of a man who was willing to kill those who stood in his way, whether they were lovers, employees, or simply people who had the misfortune of getting too close to him. But these were not the crimes of a man driven by a bloodlust to kill hundreds. Holmes' murders were calculated, methodical, and often financially motivated. He killed to protect his scams and maintain control over his victims. The arrest and trial of H.H. Holmes. For years, Holmes evaded the law through a combination of charm, manipulation, and constantly moving from place to place. But in 1894, his elaborate schemes finally began to unravel, and it wasn't the murders that brought him down, it was an insurance scam gone wrong. Holmes had been working with a man named Benjamin Pitzel, one of his longtime accomplices in fraud. Together, they devised a plan to fake Pitzel's death and collect a $10,000 insurance payout. Holmes was supposed to find a cadaver to stand in for Pitzel, but instead, he decided to kill Pitzel for real. Holmes used chloroform to knock Pitzel unconscious, then set his body on fire to make it look like an accident. But this time, Holmes had left too much evidence behind. Pitzel's death was quickly traced back to Holmes, and investigators began digging deeper into his background. They uncovered a trail of suspicious deaths, disappearances, and financial fraud that stretched across several states. By the time Holmes was arrested in Boston in November 1894, the media frenzy had already begun. Reporters flocked to cover the trial, and the sensational stories of the murder castle began to dominate headlines. Holmes was tried for the murder of Benjamin Pitzel in October 1895. The trial was a spectacle, with Holmes acting as his own attorney for part of the proceedings. He maintained his innocence on some charges while confessing to others, often in a manner that seemed designed to confuse and distract. But despite his manipulative tactics, the evidence was overwhelming. Holmes was convicted and sentenced to death. On May 7, 1896, Holmes was hanged at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. His final moments were eerily calm, as he refused to show any fear or remorse. Even in death, the legend of H.H. Holmes was only just beginning to grow. In conclusion, as we conclude our investigation into H.H. Holmes and the so-called murder castle, one thing becomes clear: the story of Holmes is as much about myth as it is about reality. While he was undoubtedly a dangerous man and a murderer, the tales of mass killings and a labyrinth designed for death have been greatly exaggerated over time. The real Holmes was a conman, a fraudster who killed when it was convenient, but he was not the supernatural villain the press made him out to be. Still, the murders he did commit were horrifying in their own right, and his manipulation of those around him speaks to a deeply disturbed mind. In the end, the story of H.H. Holmes is a reminder of how easily fact can become fiction, especially when sensational headlines are involved. In our next episode, we'll shift from the world of serial killers to one of the most famous art heists in history. We'll explore the theft of Edvard Munch's iconic painting, The Scream, stolen not once but twice. Who were the masterminds behind these audacious heists, and what drove them to target such an iconic work of art? Join me as we uncover the truth behind this mysterious crime. Thank you for listening to AI True Crime. I'll see you next time.